This is Green Tide Rising, a podcast following the green wave movement in Latin America.
And how it's unveiling a blueprint for global reproductive freedom. I'm Mónica Morales Garcia.
And I'm Asha Daya. Last episode, we spoke with our green wave expert Jimena Casas and other activists and organizers about the state of reproductive rights in the US and how the green wave is beginning to make its way here, as long as we make it happen.
In our season finale, we're at the U.S. Mexico border to focus on the people who have been working so hard over the past few years to bring the green wave to the U.S. because the stakes are high.
Throughout this series, we've amplified both the seminal and the unsung stories of the green wave, the stories that just aren't part of our daily news feeds. And our hope is that the voices you've heard in Green Tide Rising have inspired you as well.
So we're going to peel back a few layers of what's happening in the U.S., specifically in Texas. And our guests in this episode remind us of a few key things. How humanitarianism crosses borders, how religion can be a tool to champion repo rights as opposed to being a source of guilt or shame, the importance of medically accurate information about medication abortion, the vital role of accompaniment networks, and the power of the Latino vote in the 2024 election for abortion rights.
This episode is dedicated to all the advocates and everyday people who are working in community to create opportunities for pregnant people in Latin America and now the most restricted U.S. states.
And to all the Latino voters. And with the next administration right around the corner, we can see two very different reproductive rights futures based on the outcome of this presidential election.
First, we have the Democratic nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris.
We have worked too hard and fought too long to see our daughters grow up in a world with fewer rights than our mothers.
And then we have former President Donald Trump, who has been notoriously ambiguous in his stance on abortion.
Instead, we hear him express these kind of statements praising the very Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe, that he himself handpicked.
I want to thank the 6 justices, Chief Justice John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and Neil Gorsuch, incredible people.
But we get the idea.
Over this series, we've shown that politicizing abortion is based in the patriarchal tradition of controlling women and people who can get pregnant to preserve the power of the anti-abortion coalition and to ultimately organize them around a certain political candidate or party. But with the green wave, things are beginning to shift.
I really hope that the elections will show us a better future, that we have Kamala take on that.
For abortion advocates, this election, there is a clear candidate. Vice President Kamala Harris.
So it's a choice between the anti-abortion former president and potentially the first Black and South Asian woman who is the most pro-choice candidate the U.S. has ever had.
It's so incredible to understand the political importance that she has now for the world, not only for the United States, for the world.
As we round out season 1 of Green Tide Rising, we are headed to the U.S. Mexico southern border in the state of Texas, home to some of the most restrictive abortion bans in the country.
There are far too many women who have suffered at the hands of anti-abortion laws in Texas, and Jennifer Alvarez Estrada Glick was one of them. Jenny was a nurse's aide with a high-risk pregnancy due to pre-existing conditions. She was also uninsured. Throughout her pregnancy, Jenny's health deteriorated due to hypertension. Without insurance, she couldn't afford a hospital stay, and at 26 weeks pregnant, she became seriously ill.
In the small town where she lived, the only options for hospitals were Catholic institutions, which are not only notorious for denying life-saving abortion care and reproductive care, but they own 1 in 6 hospital beds across the U.S. For many patients, especially in rural and low-income areas, a Catholic hospital is the only choice. For Jenny, at no point during her pregnancy was abortion mentioned. She wasn't given any information that an abortion could have saved her life, as medical experts who examined her file after determined. Jenny died on July 10th, 2022, at 31 weeks pregnant, just 2 weeks after Roe was overturned. But in Texas, SB 8 was already the law of the land, which meant that for women in Jenny's position, despite this awful law being introduced under the guise of saving life, it ended up becoming a death sentence.
But like we've seen throughout Latin America, and even in the most repressive systems here in the US that people like Jennifer experienced, women will fight for reproductive rights, no matter the legal or cultural barriers or physical borders standing in their way.
Nosotras empezaron a llegar antes de la pandemia muchas solicitudes de apoyo para aborto.
This is Verónica Cruz. She goes by Vero. And she is the founder and executive director of Las Libres. Today, Vero and Las Libres help American women and women all over the globe have medication abortions. They do this by shipping out the World Health Organization gold standard for medication abortion, the combination of mifepristone and misoprostol, often referred to as Miffy and Miso. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, before everything shut down in 2020, Las Libres began getting a lot of requests, and they didn't really know why.
Y nosotras no entendíamos mucho porque nosotras, por cierto, nunca hemos sido muy de redes sociales. Es decir, todo el mundo nos etiqueta, todo el mundo publica algo de nosotras, pero nosotras no estamos ahí todo el tiempo.
But then they noticed this post on Facebook. It had thousands of likes and had been shared over 10 million times. It was a picture of a large semi-truck that's used to transport fruit. The truck was covered with a tarp, and on the tarp read, Miffy Guy Miso. It's one of the brand names of the abortion pills, and on the post, the caption read,
Qué mal que exista el misoprostol. Qué mal que exista la mifepristona y el misoprostol. Qué mal que existe el aborto con medicamentos. Qué mal que las mujeres puedan hacerse el aborto en casa sin supervisión médica.
And finally, at the end of the caption, it said,
Qué mal que existan las libres. Si necesitas un aborto con medicamento, aquí está su página, ¿no?
They were shocked because, sure, they posted on socials, but Vero didn't make memes. They didn't know who made it.
Esa publicación dio millones de vueltas. Entonces, en la pandemia, nosotras no cerramos, no pudimos cerrar porque éramos una de las redes abiertas con todas las posibilidades de estar apoyando y acompañando a mujeres no solo de México, sino de cualquier parte del mundo.
And because Mexico and the United States share a border, many of the women who went looking for care were women in the US.
Y con esa publicación, pues más, estaban llegando.
So, through the hardest parts of the pandemic, Las Libres was shipping out abortion pills throughout the world. And then, SB 8 happened.
El 1 de septiembre del 2021 conocimos el SBA o la ley del latido famosa.
Senate Bill 8 is now incorporated into law, but it's something that came out of the Texas legislature before Dobbs.
This is Nancy Cárdenas Peña. She's a Texan, and she's the campaign director for Abortion on Our Own Terms, a national campaign advocating to make safe, effective, self-managed abortion accessible to all.
SB 8 prohibited abortion at 6 weeks, and it included an aiding and abetting clause. And what that meant was that if you were helping someone get an abortion in the state of Texas post 6 weeks, then you would be subject to some pretty big fines and penalties.
They could be up to $10,000.
There's like legal ping pong for a good chunk of time.
But the bill was eventually passed on September 1st, 2021. And it was shocking, not just because it was an unprecedented law, but because of what was happening on the other side of the border.
5 o 6 días después, la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación Mexicana, el 7 de septiembre del 2021, declara inconstitucional el delito de aborto. Entonces, en todo el territorio mexicano, también para nosotras y para todo el mundo fue una sorpresa. Todo el mundo literal estábamos en shock porque era Estados Unidos va para atrás, México va para adelante en este tema. ¿Cómo puede suceder eso? Hubo muchísima atención mediática, por supuesto, los medios, toda la media de Estados Unidos estaba así como, ¿cómo pasa esto?
The stark and horrifying contrast between Mexico and the US captured media attention, and Vero began getting a lot of media requests about what was happening.
Todo el tiempo tratando de explicar lo que estaba pasando en México, lo que pasó en Estados Unidos, pero hay un periodista que me pregunta, un periodista de Estados Unidos, me dice, oye Vero, si hace 21 años Las Libres desarrolló un modelo de acompañamiento en el estado más restrictivo de México, donde sí hubo en las cárceles mujeres por abortar, ¿quiere decir que ese modelo hoy se podría implementar en Texas? Y yo digo, sí.
To this day, Vero still provides healthcare for those seeking it.
We've always had this transaction of healthcare with Mexico, but the way that it has been so much more intentional about creating that solidarity and those systems and networks of support, Las Libres and talking to Verónica and all of these different other types of resources have just paved the way for the green wave to stay. It's definitely in the everyday conversations that people are having, and it's definitely here.
This is Green Tide Rising. Don't go anywhere.
Hi, Asha.
Hi, Monica, and welcome everyone to episode 8 of Green Tide Rising. And even though it is our season finale, we will be back for a bonus episode after the election, so stay tuned for that.
In this episode, we are in the U.S., where a presidential election could determine if the country will continue to roll back human rights or if we'll have the opportunity to move forward.
The feminist network is made up of volunteers and women and people and folks that are really being creative and committed in their advocacy, ensuring that people are accessing the right information and the services.
This is Dr. Roopan Gill. She's the CEO and co-founder of Vitala Global. And she's also an OBGYN. Roopan has spent a lot of time in Latin America and has learned from organizations on the ground about what kind of reproductive care people need in restrictive states. And for about a year, she's been working to bring over some of that feminist movement to the US.
So when I say acompañantes, this is really something that we've learned about in Latin America, and I think now it's coming up into the United States as well. But it is just women who have come together and are volunteering and have been creative in terms of supporting other people, abortion seekers, to essentially guide them through their abortion process, help them with the information they need, cooking them food, creating a safe space. It's like this model of care that we don't necessarily see in the formal health system that feminists in this ecosystem providing abortion access are doing so well. And that accompaniment can look like in-person accompaniment. It can look like conversations people have via hotline.
To expand on existing care networks, Roopan created the app Aya Contingo with the help of feminists and reproductive health experts in Latin America. It provides resources for obtaining and using abortion pills. And the chat is staffed with professional counselors who can walk users through the entire process.
We're going to be reaching our 1-year anniversary for when we launched in the US. And really, we never thought we were going to be doing work in the United States, right? Like it was, our whole thing was that we were going to do work in low middle income countries, humanitarian settings, continue to expand Aya in contexts where the laws are very restrictive. We already were watching the situation happen when SB8 happened in Texas, and then Roe fell. And people were already asking us, even before Roe fell, my gosh, like Aya Contingo is such an essential resource, especially in states like Texas. It can provide the information, the accompaniment, the support. It's a harm reduction tool. You've already proven it in Venezuela. We already had the data. We knew, like, it's working.
And so Roopan, seeing what was happening in Texas, started to do the work of connecting with the organizations that were already doing some of this work on the ground.
What are people already doing in the United States? We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And that's how we really got to know about 60 plus organizations in the United States, partnering with Planned Parenthood, partnering with Plan C Pills, Latina Institute, and other Latin focus groups.
This is Lourdes Rivera. She's the president of Pregnancy Justice, a national legal organization that advocates for and defends the rights of pregnant people in the U.S.
The UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute, they found even before Roe was overturned that about 46% of Latinas ages 18 to 44 lived in abortion-restricted states. So these are the same states that are now with abortion bans. So researchers concluded that the harmful impacts of overturning Roe are likely to disproportionately affect Latinas who will face increased financial barriers, the need to travel to access care.
In September 2024, Pregnancy Justice released a new report which found that in the first year after the Dobbs decision, at least 210 pregnant people faced criminal charges for conduct associated with pregnancy, abortion, pregnancy loss, or birth. This is the highest number of pregnancy-related prosecutions documented in a single year. And the majority of people impacted by these restrictions are low-income folks. These statistics are only likely to increase, especially among Latinas, unless we drastically change course, starting with who we elect as our next president.
What is more clear than ever is that the U.S. can't hold itself as the leader of human rights now that Roe is gone. And state restrictions are causing not only more harm, but also preventable deaths, as we've seen in the stories of Amber Thurman and Candy Miller in Georgia, and Jennifer Alvarez Estrada Glick, a young Latina woman and mother who died in Texas in 2022 due to the denial of life-saving abortion care.
Historically, there's been a lot of U.S. exceptionalism. It's like human rights pertains to places outside of the U.S. We got this, right? And of course, we see that's not really true.
The way Lourdes explains, this exceptionalism has meant that the United States has, for too long, thought it didn't need help or didn't need to be part of a wider community. Yet where things stand, we urgently need the green wave.
We haven't been part of a global human rights movement in the same ways that global feminist movements have been.
So how do we join this movement that shifts the power dynamic from the hands of the government, the church, or the medical system to that of individual people who want to make autonomous and safe decisions about their lives and bodies? As Roopan from Vitala shares, it begins with accompaniment, which directly serves the most vulnerable communities, something their app Aya Contingo is providing.
And there's nothing in the United States that's a Spanish first resource around the abortion space. It was mind-boggling. Our role has really been to be that accompaniment, digital accompaniment tool, because when Roe fell, there are so many amazing resources that are out there, like Plan C pills, M&A hotline, I Need an A, that are providing the information. Then they're vetting these resources around abortion, online pharmacies, and abortion pill providers. And actually, what's been very interesting is that with Roe falling, you have so many of these popping up, right? There's a lot of online pharmacies and people are getting the pills in all 50 states. So now people are getting pills in people's hands. But what we noted and what we saw in terms of our work is that then people are not provided the accompaniment and the support of how to go through that process. As Aya's getting more visibility, especially in the U.S., we started in Latin America, but our work is transcending borders.
Vitala knew from their early work that to be successful in the United States, they would need to be in partnership with organizations across the reproductive access and accompaniment spectrum.
And we're doing it in various ways through the groups in Mexico. So feminist groups that have been doing this work for decades, like Las Libres in Mexico, which we know because Vero has been in the media, so it's not a secret, but she's been pivotal in this, and she's a partner to our work as well.
As Roopan mentioned, Vero from Las Libres has been essential to bringing the accompaniment networks into the U.S. But even before states like Texas needed Vero's help, 20 years ago, she was just trying to help Mexican women in her state of Guanajuato.
En el año 2000, justo Las Libres estábamos ya decidiendo ser una organización feminista, la primera en un estado muy conservador. Sin embargo, el 3 de agosto, el Congreso Local de Guanajuato elimina la única causa, la única posibilidad que las mujeres tenían para interrumpir embarazos producto de violación.
And the law went even further. It said that if a woman was to violate the law and get an abortion after a sexual assault, she could end up in jail for 8 years.
Nosotras, por supuesto, nos pareció una locura. Entonces, lo que hicimos nosotras fue salir públicamente y decir, nosotras vamos a garantizarles los abortos legales, gratuitos y seguros a todas las niñas y mujeres víctimas de violación.
When Vero started Las Libres, she envisioned a feminist activist organization that would help Mexican women in desperate situations.
Como éramos tan populares, como éramos tan públicas, pues la gente empezó a llegar con nosotras. Cuando llegó la primera niña, nosotras dijimos, ok, ¿ahora cómo le hacemos para garantizarle?
Early on, the group provided legal counsel for victims of domestic violence and demanded freedom for women whose abortions had landed them in jail. And perhaps most importantly, they also provided free abortion pills.
Pero muy rápido llegaron mujeres que nos decían, yo no soy víctima de violación, pero también quiero interrumpir este embarazo no deseado. Y nosotras dijimos, el procedimiento es el mismo, ¿no? Más allá de lo que diga la ley, ellas tienen derecho, el procedimiento es lo mismo, nosotras lo podemos garantizar. Y así nace el modelo de acompañamiento de Las Libres, acompañando abortos seguros en casa sin supervisión médica. Y nada.
Vero remembers when women, those who hadn't necessarily experienced any form of violence, also reached out to her organization, looking for help. It was a moment of realization that the work that they were doing was way bigger than they initially anticipated.
Y las primeras narrativas, hace 24 años, a mí me impresionaban muchísimo. De hecho, creo que de ellas mismas sale la inspiración de cómo hacer las redes de acompañamiento, porque ellas decían, yo sí tengo una razón justificable para tener un aborto, pero no estoy de acuerdo con el aborto, ¿no? Las demás no deberían poder abortar, si solo andan ahí por gusto, ¿no?
It didn't really matter why they were getting an abortion. It was their decision, and Vero made sure every person was able to choose whether to have a child or not.
Entonces, si tú tienes derecho, ¿qué piensas del resto de las personas? Pero sobre todo nos dimos cuenta que esas primeras mujeres, por obvias razones, como el aborto está tan estigmatizado, con tanta carga negativa, tenían muy mala información sobre el aborto, ¿no? El aborto es malo, el aborto es delito, el aborto es pecado, se está matando a alguien. Entonces me di cuenta que hablar sobre el aborto, así sencillamente dialogar y hablar sobre el aborto, se despejaban muchísimas dudas, mucha mala información que la gente tenía, y cuando sabía realmente que era un aborto o de dónde había obtenido la información sobre aborto, se daba cuenta que estaba muy mal informada.
And those women who would seek accompaniment thinking they were the exception, those were the very women who would come back helping others needing abortions.
Y decían, si yo lo viví así, si me siento liberada, si estoy viva, si no me pasó nada, si además me acompañaron, si además no me juzgaron, ¿qué puedo hacer yo para que todas lo vivan igual? Yo me di cuenta de ese poder que tenía de transformación, las redes, de esa narrativa, pero sobre todo, es muy distinto vivenciar el aborto como un delito o con estigma a vivenciarlo como un derecho. Y por eso Las Libres empezamos a decir, pues vamos a hacer espacios para la vivencia del derecho. No importa lo que diga la familia, no importa lo que digan allá afuera, no importa que la ley diga lo contrario, lo importante es que un grupo de mujeres construya espacios seguros para la vivencia del derecho.
Something as simple as one woman, or maybe a few women, sharing stories and choosing to speak up, that creates ripple effects. Those are the moments where collective power is built.
Y muy rápido, las mujeres empezaron a contárselo a todo el mundo. Entonces, obviamente, ya empezaban a llegar solas. Las primeras que las empezaron a acompañar fueron amigas, ¿no? Incluso amigas que decían, yo estoy en contra del aborto, pero es mi amiga y la voy a ayudar. A llegar con parejas, a llegar con padres y madres, a llegar con abuelas, a llegar con toda la familia, a llegar con gente de la comunidad. Y ahí nos dimos cuenta nosotras que esas redes orgánicas que de boca en boca se iban pasando la experiencia del aborto era el poder colectivo más grande que podía existir.
And part of that stigma comes from the influence of religion. Here in the United States, many of us are very familiar with the way white evangelicals have been influencing politics, law, media narratives, and societal attitudes by being the loudest voice in the room for decades. They are also adept at exporting their tactics overseas, which we saw in Brazil in episode 6. In Mexico and across the rest of Latin America, the presence of the Catholic Church shows up in the same way.
Catholicism is very widespread, as you may know.
This is Maria Consuelo Mejia. She's a devout Catholic who currently works at the Mexican National Women's Institute. But in 1994, she co-founded and became the executive director of Catholics for the Right to Decide in Mexico.
It played the role of being in alliance with the governments that repressed social movements. And it also played a role as part of the theology of liberation within the Catholic Church, which has been a movement within the priests and members of the Catholic Church who have been working in solidarity with popular demands and movements.
And one of those movements was the fundamental human right to have an abortion. And for Maria, she wanted women to know
women who have abortions, they will not go to hell. That is a decision that they can make because they are creatures created in the image of God. So they have the possibility to make decisions. Unfortunately, and sad for me as a Catholic, the main adversary in the world of sexual and reproductive rights is the Catholic Church, is the Vatican.
But she says that the Catholic Church is more than just the Vatican and more than its bishops.
And they play with this character of being a civil state. The Vatican is not a state. It doesn't fulfill any of the conditions to be a state. Still, they have a representation. They have a seat at the United Nations.
The seat is called the Holy See.
And from there, they are leading all the opposition to gender equality, sexual and reproductive health and rights, youth and adolescents' rights to reproductive health. They have dedicated a lot of resources to oppose any liberalization of laws, any opening of conditions for women to have access to abortions in Latin America.
Maria mentioned gender equality here, and this is important because like in the US with the evangelical influence in politics and law, it's not just abortion rights being attacked. It is all forms of bodily autonomy, including LGBTQ+ rights. It is all connected. And the Catholic Church having a powerful seat at the United Nations table enables them to do all of this and more.
They use everything. They use political pressure, they use economical pressure, they use threatening the governments with sending the masses of Catholics against them. They use everything.
And they've had a lot of success until
the scandal that arose worldwide about sexual abuse within the Catholic Church.
In the U.S., the most publicized scandal was in 2018, when a court found that the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania covered up the childhood sexual abuse of over 1,000 children by more than 300 priests over a period of 70 years. And that was just one state in the U.S. It made many people question whether the Catholic Church could claim they care about life if they were the ones working so hard to cover up the widespread sexual abuse of the very children they supposedly wanted to protect.
The scandal eroded the moral authority of the bishops and priests and of the church in a way. Nevertheless, I think that there is still a strong group of members of the church working for social justice from different points.
Despite the proverbial and literal loudest voice in the room being the Holy See, there are many nuns and priests who are in solidarity with marginalized communities.
That's a reality own many of the hospitals at the rural levels. So those kinds of presence of the Catholic Church in the life of people have to be taken carefully because the state cannot provide anything for the health of the people in that community. There is a Catholic priest or a Catholic nun that knows how to do it.
Maria thinks that there's still more work to do. because Catholicism is highly associated with guilt.
The idea of the Catholic doctrine as a doctrine where everything is, if you don't obey, I will punish you. And so people are all the time asking forgiveness for the sins they made, which is completely out of the way in the real interpretation of Catholicism and many of the doctrine made by feminist theologists, for example.
It doesn't have to be a choice between religion or abortion. In fact, there's a long history of religious leaders supporting abortion rights, albeit under the radar. In the United States, before Roe v. Wade was decided, there was a group called the Clergy Consultation Service who counseled and referred people to licensed doctors for safe abortions. Started in 1967 by a group of 21 Protestant ministers and Jewish rabbis in New York City, the group grew to incorporate chapters in 38 states with approximately 3,000 clergy as members. I guess you could call it an early accompaniment service led by religious leaders. They were breaking the mold, and they showed up in the lives of people as representatives of God's love, affirming the right to abortion as sacred.
As a Catholic, Maria's life and perspective was forever changed by the religious leaders determined to shift the narrative around faith.
Feminist theologies have been so important to break this idea that God is this burdened man that comes with a stick and kicks you. It is the idea that God is goodness, is solidarity, is comprehension. He is, or she, because God can be a woman or God can be a community. There are many ideas of what God can be. It's not evil. It's good. It's comprehension. It's humanity.
But she understands that could be a hard concept for people to take in, just like the first time she heard it from a Brazilian theologian.
I felt so strange. And because she said also, God has no sex, God has no figure, we were in with our companions like, oh my God, what is this? It was difficult to understand that part. But it's real. Humanity is not, God didn't create it. If this is the idea of God, of divinities didn't create it, all this reality to make us suffer. That's not the idea. And that also has been a very important argument among Catholic people. Catholicism is not only suffering because you will be happy in the next life. No. That you are living here and now, and that you have rights, and you can fight for them.
So how do we fight for our rights right here and right now? Because as former Planned Parenthood CEO and women's leadership expert Gloria Felt once told me in an interview, fighting back is not enough. We need to fight forward. We can set the agenda. Here's Lourdes Rivera, President of Pregnancy Justice again.
I think that this is an opportunity, now that we don't have Roe, to imagine something much more comprehensive and robust that protects and advances decision-making, bodily autonomy, dignity of all pregnant people.
And this opportunity can be realized by a human rights-centered movement powered by everyday people.
The United States is grappling with the loss of this fundamental right to abortion. Latin America is in the midst of this green wave, which is extending abortion rights.
There is a story of hope here, because over the past couple of years, a number of activists and organizers have been gathering to strategize about how to bring the green wave to the United States and make women's lives better. Women's Equality Center, the Latina Institute, and IPAS brought together abortion rights activists from Latin America and the US to share strategies and solidarity toward cross-border collaboration for reproductive justice. They first met in early 2023 and again in May 2024.
Dr. Roopan Gill from Vitala, who was present at the second gathering, knows firsthand the ripple effects of this movement and is excited to see how the green wave might unfold in the U.S.
That energy, that emotion, all that hard work and taking evidence-based policy, medical information, all of that, and then seeing like the law change, right? Like that for me It's because it's the collective and the solidarity. That's what I feel like the green wave really defines. The green wave gives you hope, right? And I hope that green wave that we've seen go through all of Latin America and now is moving into the United States gives us hope.
And even in some of the most regressive states with harsh abortion policies, women find a way. And one way is messaging Las Libres on WhatsApp or Signal or by text and getting abortion medication delivered to your home. And it's all free.
Un paquete típico va a ser para la mayoría de las personas, como digo, que nos solicitan, que son menos de 12 semanas, va a ser una mifepristona, 6 de misoprostol, algunos paquetes, porque tenemos unas voluntarias bastante creativas, pueden mandar incluso las toallas sanitarias que se necesitan, unas tiritas de miel, porque hay gente que le puede causar náuseas el medicamento, entonces la miel o un dulcito para que pueda controlarlo. Van a ir las pastillas para dolor en caso de que haya dolor, ibuprofeno o cualquier otra pastilla en caso de que necesiten. Algunas otras incluso les llega el paquete con un regalito, puede ser incluso unos aretes, ¿no? Y una notita que va a decir como no estás sola, y eso las mujeres luego nos dicen que les gusta y lo sienten como que aunque alguien no esté físicamente ahí, saben que alguien está ahí, ¿no?
And we know that abortion medication is safe. Dr. Roopan Gill, again.
They're safer than taking penicillin, a shot of penicillin, or even your Tylenol, right? We don't need to keep studying the safety because we have a plentitude of that data, right? Interestingly, I think it's important to know as well that there's two regimens, right? There's one that is mifepristone and misoprostol, and then also misoprostol alone. You'll swallow the one mifepristone, which is 200 milligrams, and then 24 to 48 hours later, we suggest that's when folks will take the misoprostol. And the misoprostol is inside the cheek and teeth. You can do it under the tongue. All 4 tablets can be under the tongue. Or the final one is a vaginal route, which is also all 4 tablets going in the vagina. However, you can do it, it's effective, but we don't suggest this one in Aya because the pills can remain in the vagina.
And if you are in a restrictive country or state, there can be identifiable remains, but if taken orally, a doctor cannot tell if the termination of pregnancy was a miscarriage or a selective abortion.
What's very important to know is that when you take the misoprostol, you allow it to dissolve for 30 minutes, regardless of the route in which you've done it, and then you can swallow the remains.
We're hearing so much about self-managed abortion now, more than probably ever before.
Nancy Cárdenas Peña from Abortion on Our Own Terms, again.
People have been terminating their pregnancy since the beginning of time.
Now that Texas basically has a full ban in place, Nancy knows how to manage through this landscape. And it's thanks to Vero from Las Libres.
It was just a chaotic time for all of us. And I happened to be meeting with a reporter who wanted to learn a little bit more about the intersection of immigration and reproductive healthcare. And she's like, oh my God, guess what? There's this organization called Las Libres and they're hosting something. And I'm sure that they would love to talk. And that's how that conversation started. It was around the time where Verónica and Las Libres were doing this much more focus on the United States and realizing that there needed to be a much more intentional push for collaboration. And so the conversation started like that, and it's evolved and it's been consistent ever since. I think that something really important and the framework that we're trying to adopt is always maintaining that international solidarity.
It's the community aspect we've talked so much about, and it works on a global scale too.
It's being able to learn so much from so many different groups who are doing amazing work and having that continue, regardless of what happens in the United States. Even if we were to get a federal protection again, it's always about opening and dreaming of this better world for abortion care, because we never want to go back to where we were feeling helpless and feeling like we don't have enough options. Like, we want to create and cultivate this healthy ecosystem of abortion care options. And talking all of that with Vero and learning so much from her has been sort of the silver lining in all of this.
Today's episode truly serves to enforce the power of community and the power of women, especially Latina women, in this fight for reproductive freedom. They have brought the green wave to the US.
Being a Latino woman myself, I feel compelled to say that Latino women are really the driving force of the Latino electorate. While both men and women have started to turn out at higher rates, we do see a slightly higher rate of turnout among Latino women than we do among men.
That's Research Director Maria de Franco Quiñonez from Equis. Equis is a set of organizations that work to engage Latino voters in the U.S. And to end the season with a call to action to get out the vote, we are speaking with Maria and her colleague, Senior VP of Communications, Nery Espinosa.
Thanks to the work of Equis, we know the power of the Latino vote this cycle is going to be pivotal for abortion rights.
We are growing every year more and more. There are 65.2 million Latinos in the US. That's about 19% of the population. Every year, about 1.4 million Hispanics in the US become eligible to vote. Like 1.4 million Latinos. That's on average, like a Latino becomes newly eligible to vote every 22 seconds. There's like a new Latino voter, which is like crazy to think about, right? So in this coming election, we have 36.2 million Latinos that will be eligible to vote. So there is just like this huge opportunity there. And again, and that's for this year. By 2060, 1 in 4 Americans will be Latinos. And so like our power, our numbers will continue to grow. And so this electorate is going to be more and more crucial and important to the future of this country.
At Equis, how are you looking to past elections to determine what the outcome might be for this year?
The sheer power that really means in terms of the way that Latinos can swing elections is something that is at the back of our minds all the time when we're thinking about the role that we can play and the role that Latinos will play in presidential elections, Senate elections, governor elections, etc. And part of what we saw back in 2020 was, in addition to Latinos making up a larger portion of eligible voters, Latinos also turned out at higher rates than what we had seen in previous elections. But to caveat that, that's still lower than what we see for other groups, other racial and ethnic groups, whether it's white voters, Black voters, AAPI voters. And so it just goes to show the remaining kind of opportunity for even greater power with the Latino electorate. And that's all about turnout and how many folks are showing up to vote.
Are Latino voters turning out for Republicans or Democrats?
So Latino voters have historically supported Democratic candidates at higher rates than Republican candidates, and that is still the case. However, we did see a shift in 2020 that also seemed to defy the shifts that we saw in other racial groups. So when we look at Latino voters, we actually saw about an 8-point shift away from the Democratic candidate at the time and a shift toward Trump. And it's also why there was so much of a focus on Latino voters leading up to 2022. The question was, would that support jump back to what we had seen in previous cycles? Was 2020 a blip? Or would it continue to decrease? Would we actually see even greater support for Republican candidates than what we had seen back in 2020? And what we ended up seeing was a great deal of stability in support levels among Latino voters back in 2022. And so it leaves 2024 as the next big question mark to see again if we'll go back to historic support levels among Latino voters, or we'll continue to see the sort of new norm that was set back in 2020.
There are so many issues on the line for 2024, and abortion is a key issue. What can you tell us about the ways in which Latinos are thinking about bodily autonomy?
The impact of the Dobbs decision could not really be overstated. And so from the very beginning, we saw very strong rejection of the Dobbs decision. Over 60% of Latino voters rejected the Dobbs decision. And that's something that we saw consistently across states and across different waves of polling that we did. And that included practicing Catholics. That was one of the big questions that folks had for us during the 2022 election and afterward was, can we see this similar dynamic playing out even among Catholic voters? And so we always tried to look at this by focusing on folks who were more religious and saw, again, strong majorities rejecting the Dobbs decision and rejecting other efforts to take away abortion rights. Abortion rights were the number 2 issue for Latino voters back in 2022 under sort of concerns about the economy and cost of living. And it was that issue and having that issue at the forefront that really anchored support for Democratic candidates and improved turnout among Latino voters. We saw that those folks who were prioritizing abortion rights as a top concern were much more likely to turn out in the election than folks who were prioritizing other issues.
There seems to be such a prevailing sentiment that the Latino population would not be pro-choice because of their deep connection to Catholicism. Nery, is that true, or is there something more nuanced going on here?
I think there's been, for a long time, this like myth or apprehension that, oh, Latinos are conservative, like they're not going to be pro-abortion. But honestly, all the data shows is that like Latinos, just like many other people in our country, believe in the right to abortion, believe that this is like a human right. It just speaks to our community. Latinos are not off on some other side on this issue. Actually, we're very much like very clear about what we believe on this.
What do candidates need to be doing more of to reach Latino voters and engage them on abortion? And are they doing enough right now?
We've seen some apprehension, some fear that we can't talk to Latinos about abortion. I think our polling, as well as other groups that are also doing this work and communicating with Latinos on this issue, have found that's not true at all. That's not what the data shows at all. There's a need to also communicate on this in Spanish. And so what our research has shown in polling is that there is an underinvestment in reaching our community, particularly Spanish-speaking Latinos. And so that is an area where we're always trying to push people talk to our community about abortion, talk about it to our Spanish-speaking community. They need to hear more about this issue and why it's important for them to add vote.
I think that's something that we have seen both in communication with Latino voters, but also in communication more broadly, but really being able to lean into the power of sharing stories about people who have been impacted. I mean, I think that both from an organizing perspective and the way in which you can have a conversation with someone, leaning into the power of sharing the stories of women who've been impacted by the extreme abortion bans in their states has been incredibly powerful and is something that we hope to continue to see, especially also in Spanish communication, like Nery was mentioning.
One of the most exciting aspects of this upcoming election is the huge number of young people voting. In fact, there are about 41 million Gen Z eligible voters this cycle. What can you tell us about young Latino voters specifically and how to reach them?
Something that's so interesting about the Latino vote is that we're young. It's a very young electorate. I think only 33% of Latinos are, eligible to vote are ages like 50 and older. So we're a very young demographic. And I think it's good to keep in mind that for many of us, I'm an immigrant myself. Like, I didn't grow up with like, hey, you got to go vote, you got to register to vote. And so for a lot of our young voters who are like maybe first generation or even second generation, like a lot of the times, like they have to like figure it out. They're like, oh, like my family couldn't vote before me. And so like, I think you have to keep this in mind for these young voters. It's like, we really have to go and like do that outreach and do that work and making sure that like they register to vote and that they understand the stakes that are at hand. It's like the potential of having the first woman president who's a daughter of immigrants, who is a champion for reproductive rights. Like, these are all things that many young voters were looking for, and that's exciting.
There has been a lot of talk about Project 2025 in this election cycle, Trump's vision for the future, and how abortion factors into this plan. Maria, in your polling, what are the reactions you are seeing to the messages around Project 2025?
One of the reasons why abortion rights are so important when it comes to this election is really tied back to the two visions that are being presented by the presidential candidates in this election. You have a vision that is provided by Vice President Harris that is about maintaining reproductive freedoms, right? Is about making sure that families are able to make decisions for themselves and about providing the opportunity to do so, whether that's on the subject of abortion or on the subject of how they're able to provide for themselves, and tying it back to the economy. And on Trump's side, you have a vision that is tied to some of what we've seen in Project 2025, and that abortion rights are so clearly attacked by his vision for the U.S. In some of our recent polling, we included a lot of the different proposals from Project 2025, and we found that revoking access to abortion pills, which is one of the things that is listed, is the number one most rejected component of Project 2025, of all of the things that we hold. We see different spikes again of the rejection that Latino voters are clearly communicating when it comes to some of the plans that Trump and his allies have for a second presidency.
And it's not just Latinas who believe in bodily autonomy, right?
When we poll at the state level about some of the abortion bans that Republican electeds have tried to implement or have successfully implemented in states like Texas, we see really strong rejection of those bans among Latino women, but also among Latino men. I'm actually thinking one of the participants from one of our groups in Wisconsin recently was just saying, yo estoy en favor de que la gente sea libre de seguir, que todo lo que sea más conveniente, lo que es lo más conveniente. Cada quien conoce su situación y todas las situaciones son distintas. This person again saying, I don't know if I am in favor of abortion, but I just want to make sure that people can make decisions about their situation because they know their situation. So this isn't something that just the women in the groups are able to say because of their own experiences, but we even hear it coming from some of these groups that are made up of Latino men. And these are not hyper-liberal Latino men that we are including in these groups. These are Latino men who are maybe undecided about how they're going to vote, but they're not unclear about where they stand on the issue of abortion rights.
Let's talk about the abortion ballot measures for a moment, because in a number of states that will be voting on these, there are significant Latino populations. So what are you seeing from your polling about these measures?
We see very strong support for the ballot measures that exist in these states that will be on the ballot in November to protect abortion rights. I think that when we look at this for just Latino voters, we see between 60 to 70% support for these different ballot measures across these states of Nevada, Arizona, and Florida. And just like I mentioned before, this is support that cuts across religious affiliation. We see strong support for these ballot measures among practicing Catholics and non-practicing Catholics. And we see it cut across gender. We see it cut across age. And so it just goes to show that the support for these ballot measures in these states actually supersedes what we would expect from just a traditional partisan split.
Speaking of Texas, where we've been most of this episode, it's so exciting to hear that the green wave is coming ashore here.
It's been really important to lean on organizers from different countries in Latin America, especially in border states like Texas, where a lot of the Latino-led organizations are in direct communication with abortion funds in Mexico. And again, what it looks like to be able to continue to do this work, even in the face of some of the really extreme restrictions that have been implemented across some of these states.
For us, it's been incredible to see the movement sweep across Latin America. So I think for us, there are a lot of lessons to borrow and take for organizers and activists doing this work here in the US, especially how to win under especially restrictive environments that are very hostile. And so I think for us, there's like a blueprint now. There's like, okay, actually you can win. And there's a way to do that. And there's lessons to borrow. But I think for me, it's also largely an indication of like that Latinos believe in the right to choose and the access to abortion and reproductive health. And that I think what the Green Wave has really shown is that abortion is a human right.
What would you say to folks who think their vote doesn't matter?
Biden won the state of Arizona by a fraction of a percentage point. And we're talking about Biden winning 2020 by a fraction of a percentage point in a state where, about a quarter of the eligible voter population is made up by Latinos. So to me, it's just simple math. The power of the Latino vote in critical states like Arizona that are the pathway to the presidency right now is just, again, impossible to overstate. When we're talking about these razor-thin margins, nobody has the privilege to overlook the power of the Latino vote because it is in those margins that you either win or lose. I think because of the way in which we've always talked about the growth of the Latino electorate, sometimes people talk about Latino power as something that exists in the future. And I think that in both previous elections and in this upcoming one, it is very crystal clear that Latino power exists today and has existed before today and will continue to play a critical role in who wins this election.
It truly feels like we've come full circle here, from our very first episode where we saw the green wave emerge in Argentina, to this, our last, where we've seen the green wave build momentum all the way to Mexico's northern border. And it's Latinos, Latinas, Latine folks who are crossing into the U.S. to share strategies and movements that really make a difference.
The impact of the green wave will be hugely influential in continuing our efforts to fight forward here in the United States. It feels like there is hope. You know, we envision this series to be a blueprint, a tool for everyday people to know that we have power to create change, even in the unlikeliest circumstances or most adverse systems.
We hope you feel inspired, energized, maybe even empowered by all the stories and messages we've shared throughout the series. So, although this is goodbye for now, make sure you tune in for a very special post-election episode coming soon.
Monica, it's been real, and although season 1 has come to an end, I have loved being on the Green Tide Rising journey with you. You know, it's been such a privilege to interview some incredible folks from across Latin America, the Caribbean, and here in the United States. And to all our listeners and supporters, thank you for being in community with us. And be sure to share this with everyone in your network. Take the time to think about, what is your green tone, as Jimena Casas says? What role can you play in someone else's liberation, as Danielle Rodriguez from Sister Song brilliantly stated in episode 7? Tell your friends, family, and network to download and subscribe to the series, where you can now listen to every episode. This episode was produced and written by Monica Morales Garcia.
Special thanks to Jimena Casas.
Green Tide Rising is executive produced by Jess Jacobs and Leela Meadow-Connor, with associate producer Adi Biaringer.
And produced in partnership with Pod People.
Our theme music was composed by Andres Aspiri.
I'm your host, Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm your host and executive producer, Asha Dyer. We want to take a moment to shout out and thank our amazing sponsors who are supporters of independent media and without whom this series would not have been possible. Thank you to Dr. Nancy O'Reilly and the Women Connect for Good team, the Women's Foundation of California Culture Change Fund, the International Women's Media Foundation, the Miranda Family Fund, The Case for Her, Global Impact, Mountain Philanthropies, and to our fiscal sponsor, Entertainment to Effect Change.
Thank you for listening to Season 1 of Green Tide Rising. Be sure to head over to our YouTube channel and watch and share our accompanying video series, Entonces, link in the show notes.
You can also find us on social media and see more about this episode on our website, greentiderising.com. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
And one last time, adios.